Her hands shook as she held them side by side, two ultrasound prints. One belonged to her. The other claimed to. Leora stared at the images, one faded from being held too many times, the other still crisp, printed on cold paper with a name that wasn't hers. Same week, same due date, different women. Only one was real. Only one was loved. And only one was left behind. Her breath hitched as the truth settled in like a weight on her chest. He believed the other photo. Not her eyes, not her tears, not the life growing inside her. She had been his calm in the chaos, the woman who stitched meaning back into his broken life, not with promises, but with presence. Now, she was nothing more than a forgotten chapter in a story she helped build. Before we go further, if you've ever poured your heart into someone who chose a lie over your truth, take a second, please. Tap that like button, hit subscribe, and drop A in the comments if your love has ever been tested. Let's hold space for every heart that's been left behind too soon. Now let me ask you, what would you do if the person you trusted most walked out on you when you needed them the most? Would you chase closure? Would you break? Would you fight? Or would you rise so quietly, so powerfully that the silence would haunt them? This is not a story of heartbreak. It's a story of strength, of motherhood, of a woman who was told she wasn't enough and proved she always was. He was a man of headlines and corner offices, a leader who had clawed his way to power without a single helping hand. People saw the brilliance, the strategy, the empire. Leora had seen the tremors beneath all that polish, the boy who still doubted. His worth, the man who flinched at love because it asked him to stay. She had stayed. She had built a home, not out of wealth, but out of faith. She had whispered to him in the dark, "You are safe. You are enough." And yet, with a single message from another woman, he walked away from it all. He left her holding their child's heartbeat inside her, while he chased a ghost from his past. But this is not a story where she fades quietly into a footnote, because while he was falling into an old lie, she was discovering a new truth. That the strength she thought she had given him was hers all along. That she could fight for her child and her dignity without him. This is also not a story where the villain wins. The ex who played her game would soon learn that forged lives cannot sustain themselves forever. Her performance would crack under its own weight. Stay with me until the end, because what Leora does next will shock you, not with revenge, for its own sake, but with a kind of courage that changes the direction of a life. This is her story. This is your story if you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or left alone at your breaking point. And before we begin this journey into the heart of her strength, pause and think. If you were in her place, abandoned, carrying life inside you, your love dismissed as a mistake, would you fight to bring him back? Or would you build a world so full of light that he would have to crawl back to find it? Stay with me, because the answer is about to unfold. She didn't scream when he left, didn't chase, didn't beg. She closed the door gently and let the silence swallow everything. For days, the walls of their home echoed with memories that no longer belonged to her. His shoes at the door, the way he brewed coffee but never drank it, the shirt she ironed still hanging untouched in the closet. But grief, when paired with survival, becomes a kind of clarity. She packed her things in silence. No scenes, no explanations, just what mattered. A few canvases, her journals, and the ultrasound image he never held long enough to understand. The cottage she moved into had peeling paint and creaking floors, but it also had peace. It was her grandmother's, and now it was hers and the tiny life forming inside her, heartbeat steady, future unwritten. Each morning she rose before the sun, poured tea into a chipped mug, and wrote to her unborn child. You weren't made out of accident or fear. You were made out of love. Maybe that love wasn't protected the way it should have been, but it created you. And that means you're already stronger than most people ever start out. As the weeks passed, she started teaching again. Part-time art classes at the local center. She painted, sold small pieces online, paid bills, learned how to be alone without being lonely. But even as she built her new life, the questions hung in the air like unfinished sentences. What made him believe her? Why didn't he fight harder for them? Was she not enough, even after everything? The answers didn't come. Not yet. What did come, however, was something else entirely. Something unexpected. A letter. A truth. A moment so sharp it would split the past in two. And when it came, everything changed. Leora Vale believed in the quiet things. She believed in handwritten letters, in chipped teacups passed down generations, and in stories that didn't shout to be heard. She taught middle school art in a district that cut corners but never her spirit. Her hands were often stained with pastels, and her heart was full of forgotten names and quiet victories. The boy who stopped fighting after learning to paint sunsets, the girl who stopped crying when she saw her paint on paper. Leora lived in a second-floor apartment above a bookstore. Rent was tight. The faucet leaked. But she had a shelf full of memories, a cat named Hollow, and a belief that some kinds of love could still last forever if handled gently. She didn't chase ambition. She chased meaning. Every day she stood in front of children who barely spoke and found ways to make their silence matter. Callan Varelli didn't believe in quiet. He believed in execution, discipline, results. He ran Varelli Innovations, a tech firm that built neural software and predictive data systems. He was 37 and already a billionaire. His suits were tailored, his days scheduled by the minute, and his mind sharper than most men twice his age. Callan worked in glass buildings that touched the sky. His name was in magazines. He spoke on panels. He led mergers like war generals led battalions. In every room, he was either feared, followed, or envied. People said he was brilliant. Some said cold, but none really knew him. Not the board, not his colleagues, not the world that celebrated his every strategic move, because none of them saw the silence that came when he removed the tie. The quiet in his penthouse, the untouched piano in the corner, the voicemail he never deleted, the one where his mother said, "Come home, son, just once, please." They should have never met. He didn't do vacations. She didn't do chaos. But one October, Callan's driver lost control on a winding back road outside Savannah. It wasn't a major crash, a punctured tire, a bent axle, no reception. His assistant couldn't reach him. His schedule collapsed in on itself. He wandered, more annoyed than afraid, until he saw the outline of a cabin tucked between tall oaks and quiet land. It belonged to Leora's father. She had gone there to prepare it for winter, dusting off memories, checking the chimney, watering the porch plants her grandmother once sang to. She didn't recognize the man who knocked. He looked irritated, expensive, and impatient. His car keys were still in hand, as if the world owed him a solution 5 minutes ago. "I'm not a mechanic," she told him bluntly. He blinked. No one usually spoke to him like that. "I just need a phone signal. Or a landline. We don't have either." She started to close the door. "Wait," he said. "I just need somewhere to sit, just for a bit." Something in his voice wasn't harsh. It was tired. Not the kind of tired from a day at work, but the kind that clings after a life of pretending nothing gets to you. She let him in. The inside of the cabin smelled like cedar wood and old stories. She poured tea without asking. He didn't know how to say thank you without sounding like he was negotiating a contract. They sat, in silence, until it didn't feel heavy anymore. "Do you always drive into strangers' cabins?" she asked eventually. "Do you always let in strange men with $1,000 shoes?" "I was bored." He smirked. The first real one in days, maybe weeks. She learned his name only after asking twice. He didn't learn hers until he saw it stitched on the inside of an old apron hanging on the coat hook. Leora. The wind outside picked up, leaves rustling like low whispers. They ended up talking for 4 hours. Not about tech, not about data, not about shares, projections, or quarterly targets. He asked her why she painted. She told him it helped her see pain without flinching. She asked him if he was happy. He didn't answer right away. "No," he finally said. That night, he slept on the couch. She gave him an extra quilt her grandmother had made. She didn't offer to keep him company. She didn't flirt. She didn't try to impress. And somehow, that's what stayed with him. He was used to people who wanted something, who mirrored his hunger, who pretended they didn't see his emptiness so long as they could stand in his light. But Leora didn't try to fill his silence. She simply let it be. In the morning, she made pancakes and didn't ask when he was leaving. By noon, he was gone. By midnight, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Callan didn't reach out for 3 days. Not because he wasn't thinking of her, but because he didn't know how to make space for something that didn't fit into his plans. He sat at his desk overlooking the skyline, distracted through meetings, irritated by his own restlessness. He'd replay her voice, her calm, the way she looked at him like she wasn't impressed, but still curious. He sent her an email. It was short. "Are you at the cabin this weekend?" "See," she replied 2 days later. "Depends who's asking." He returned the following Saturday. There was no car trouble this time. No excuse. Just a man in a collared shirt, holding 2 coffees, standing in front of a woman who hadn't asked him to come back, but also hadn't told him not to. Leora didn't ask questions. She opened the door, accepted the drink, and went back to watering the porch ferns. He followed her without being invited. That weekend became a pattern. Every other Friday, he'd escape the steel and strategy of his corporate life and reappear at the cottage with no explanation. Sometimes he brought fresh bread. Other times, just silence. They didn't talk about the world he came from. She didn't ask about the office towers or the headlines. He didn't ask about the art supplies in her trunk or the books stacked in uneven piles. Instead, they talked about childhood. She told him her mother had left when she was 6, raised by her father, who taught her how to fix pipes, budget with dignity, and never rely on someone who lies smoothly. He told her that his father had never been a father, just a man who provided and corrected, a businessman more committed to market swings than bedtime stories. His mother had tried, but she was brittle, too worn down by a marriage held together with obligations and polite dinners. Leora listened. She didn't react. She just nodded slowly, and he realized it was the first time he'd said any of that out loud. "You talk like someone who's lived 3 lives, she said once. Callan had paused. "Sometimes it feels like I never lived even one." They began cooking together. He learned how to sauté vegetables without burning them. She let him choose the music, surprised when he picked old jazz instead of electronic playlists. On Sunday mornings, she read to him from her journals, not the personal entries, but little vignettes, moments she'd observed in strangers or childhood memories pressed into paragraphs. Once, she read a page about a boy who brought a bird with a broken wing to her class, insisting he could teach it to fly again. When she finished, Callan looked at her. "Did it fly?" "No," she said, smiling faintly, "but it felt loved." He didn't respond, just looked away and pretended to check his phone. They didn't kiss for a long time, not out of hesitation, but because the space between them wasn't fragile. It was sacred. When it finally happened, it wasn't dramatic. They were washing dishes. Her elbow bumped his. He looked down. She looked up. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. Not urgency, not hunger, but recognition. He leaned in. So did she. It felt less like discovering something new, and more like remembering something lost. Back in the city, his life continued. Calls, deadlines, board members. But now, every decision passed through an invisible filter. What would Leora think of this? Would she understand? Would she care? She became the compass in a world full of noise. She didn't tell many people about him, not because she was hiding anything, but because it felt like protecting something rare, something still forming. When she spoke of him, she didn't mention his wealth. She said, "He listens in a way most people forget to." When he spoke of her, which was rare, he said, "She makes space feel different." 6 months in, they spent their first week together outside the cabin, in New York, where he had a keynote speech. She sat in the 3rd row, scribbling on a notepad as he spoke to an audience of hundreds. She didn't clap the loudest. She didn't rush to him after. But when they got back to the hotel, she handed him a folded paper. It was a sketch, him, standing on that stage, his outline crisp, but his face drawn with gentle uncertainty. She had written under it, "Even the strongest leaders still wonder if they're enough. You were..." He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he kissed her forehead and said, "No one's ever seen me like this." Callan proposed with no speech, no theatrics, no cameras. It was a Wednesday. They were walking along a bookstore aisle, arms brushing as they moved past the poetry section. He paused in front of a title she loved, Letters to No One. She had quoted it during their second weekend together. He pulled the small ring box from his coat pocket and held it out right there, beside shelves of words that had meant something to both of them. She blinked, confused. "Is this a joke?" "No," he said. "I just don't want to ask you tomorrow, or next week. I want to ask you now, while we're still here." She stared at the box, then at him. His voice didn't shake, but his eyes did. "Yes," she said, not because it was expected, not because the ring was impressive, but because she believed him. Their wedding was quiet. No media, no announcements. Just a small clearing outside the cabin, her father officiating, his assistant standing, as a witness, and a handful of people who'd seen both of them at their lowest. She wore her mother's lace shawl. He wore his grandfather's cufflinks. During his vows, Callan didn't make promises he couldn't keep. "I won't say I'll never shut down," he told her, "but I will say I'll keep trying not to." She touched his cheek. Trying is enough. Marriage softened him in strange ways. He still woke before sunrise and checked numbers like oxygen, still kept meetings short and efficient, but now his briefcase carried small folded notes, Leora's quiet reminders written on yellow paper. "You don't have to be right today, just present. Come home tired. I'll hold that too. I love the man who pauses, not just the one who leads." He never replied to them, not with words, but he kept every single one. Leora adjusted to a new rhythm, one that required patience and self-protection in equal measure. She never doubted his care, but she did notice the moments when he drifted inward, unreachable for hours, even while sitting beside her. Sometimes she would speak, and his eyes would be somewhere else, not distracted, detached. Once, she asked him, "When you disappear like that, where do you go?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Nowhere I want to take you." She didn't press. She just nodded and placed a warm hand over his. She understood that not every door in him had a key. Some were simply never built to open. But she loved him, still, even when she felt like a guest inside his quiet spells. Their home was a balance of her softness and his order. She painted in the mornings, soft watercolors or oil studies for gallery submissions. He worked from his home office until late afternoon, often leaving the door open. Now, just to hear the scratch of her brush or the sound of a kettle boiling. They ate dinner together, always, even when deadlines loomed, even when silence filled the room more than conversation. She made it a rule, no phones at the table. He respected it, not because he wanted to, but because she never asked for much. 6 months into their marriage, they attended a fundraiser together. It was her first public appearance as Mrs. Varelli. She wore a dark green dress, simple, elegant, with no diamonds or designer label. He offered to hire a stylist. She declined. When they walked into the venue, people looked, whispered. Leora felt it, the disbelief, the curiosity. She's the one? The art teacher? But Callan didn't shrink or overcompensate. He kept one hand on her back, leaned in when she spoke, introduced her, not as his wife, but as the person who makes the hard days better. Afterward, in the car, she asked, "Was that difficult for you?" "What?" "Letting them see someone who doesn't fit the mold." He frowned slightly. "They don't get to mold me. It wasn't perfect." Some nights she felt like she was reaching across a distance that couldn't always be closed. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night from dreams he wouldn't explain, sitting, up with a clenched jaw and a look that belonged to a version of him she didn't yet know. But she never forced entry into his darkness. She just lit the room and stayed beside him. Their love was never loud. It was the kind that lived in the in-between moments, the steady hand at the small of her back, the silent glance. Across a crowded space, the worn coffee mug he always left on her side of the sink, even when she was out of town. And perhaps that's what made what came next so painful, because she had poured everything into them, into him. So when he left, it wasn't just abandonment, it was a betrayal of everything gentle she had built around his wounds. There were moments, quiet, forgettable to anyone else, when something would shift in him, a hesitation before answering, a glance that lingered not in admiration, but in retreat. Leora noticed, always did. She didn't keep a ledger of disappointments. She didn't believe in scorekeeping. But love for her had always been about noticing, the small shifts, the micro-pauses, the way silence settles when words are too heavy to lift. She noticed how he flinched slightly when she used the word forever. She noticed how he'd redirect conversations that skimmed too close to vulnerability, like the time she asked what kind of father he wanted to be, and he replied by asking what groceries they needed for the week. It wasn't that he didn't love her. She felt that he did. But there was a part of him still locked behind something invisible, not malice, not distance, but habit. Callan had learned, long ago, that closeness invited risk. So even in the presence of someone safe, the instinct to retreat never really left him. Leora never tried to fix it. She didn't see him as a project or a puzzle. She only wished he'd let her all the way in, not just into his days, but into his fears. Once, during a walk through the park, they passed a couple with a toddler chasing pigeons. The child tripped, then laughed, cheeks red from cold. Leora slowed her pace. I wonder what ours would look like. Callan was quiet for too long. When she turned, he was staring at the child, jaw set. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, he said softly. She didn't push, but the words lodged somewhere deep, alongside the others she didn't speak aloud. He never raised his voice, never disappeared without notice, never disrespected her. In fact, he tried hard, harder than most would expect from a man like him. But love wasn't just about trying. It was about letting go of fear. And that was the one thing he hadn't yet learned to do. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, she found him in his home office, staring at an old photograph. She paused in the doorway. Who's that? My mother, he said without turning. Leora stepped in slowly. The photo showed a woman smiling at a boy no more than 6, who clutched a toy robot in one hand and his mother's fingers in the other. She looks kind, Leora said. She was. She's different now. A pause. You ever talk to her? He shook his head. She gave too much to a man who never noticed, he said finally. By the time she left, there wasn't enough of her left to come back. Leora crossed the room, sat beside him, and reached for his hand. You're not him. I know, but the way he said it. She wasn't sure he did. Their last trip before the fracture was to Asheville. A quiet weekend, a rented cabin, no press, no emails. They made soup from scratch, danced in the living room, and spent an afternoon talking about the names they liked for future children, even though the idea still made Callan visibly nervous. It was the first time she saw him truly let go, belly laughing at her awful impressions of his board members, stealing bites of cookie dough when he thought she wasn't looking, falling asleep mid-sentence with his head in her lap. That night, she wrote a letter, not because she feared losing him, but because she wanted him to know what she saw in case he ever forgot. You think you're hard to love. You think people stay only if you give them perfect days. But I don't need perfect. I need present, and I need you to believe that even on the days you doubt yourself, even when the world sees you as a machine, I still see a man who deserves softness. She never gave him that letter. She hid it inside a book on the shelf, folded twice between pages he said he'd read someday, but never did. Looking back, she'd remember these things not as red flags, but as gentle warnings. Not alarms, just shadows at the edge of something otherwise bright. And perhaps that was the most painful part, because their love had felt real, built on presence, grown with intention, sealed not by spectacle but by small, everyday tenderness. But even love that feels real can be broken by a moment of doubt. Even a man held in gentleness can reach for the familiar ache of old wounds, if he never learns how to let go of them. Cassandra Albrecht returned without fanfare. No press releases, no interviews, no scandal. Just a name on a polished folder dropped on Callan's desk one Thursday morning. Licensing inquiry, Albrecht Dynamics. A proposal to collaborate on a neural interface patent. The pitch was technical, sharp, and clean, like her. Callan blinked at the name. Then again, he hadn't seen it in years, and yet something in him knew she'd reappear eventually. Some people don't vanish, they recalibrate. He closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled slowly. Not because he missed her, but because her presence always demanded attention, even in her absence. Leora first heard her name at dinner. They were eating grilled salmon and asparagus. Nothing fancy. She'd lit 2 candles on the table. The cat was curled at Callan's feet. She reached out, he said, cutting into his food. Who? Cassandra. She's heading a startup now. Wants to license some of our tech. Leora didn't move. You're considering it? She's not proposing a partnership, just a licensing deal. It's solid, clean. Leora sipped her water. That woman nearly burned your company to the ground. That was years ago. She didn't just ruin your trust. She hurt people, Callan. You had to settle lawsuits because of her. He shrugged. People change. No, people adjust. Cassandra was never uncertain about what she wanted. You were just convenient until you weren't. He paused. It's business, Leora, that's all. If we don't take the deal, someone else will. You don't need it. He leaned back, voice steady. I'm not asking for permission. I didn't say you were. But if she's back, don't pretend it doesn't mean something. He didn't reply. She didn't push further. But something shifted after that. Not an argument, not a breakdown. Just Something quieter, like a window left open in winter, barely noticed but felt nonetheless. Cassandra arrived at the office the following Monday. The receptionist said she smelled like a promise. Polished, poised, magnetic. Her heels clicked with intention. Her blazer fit like it had been sewn onto her. Her smile never reached her eyes, but that didn't stop people from leaning in. Callan met her in the 14th floor conference room. They shook hands like strangers, but it wasn't cold, just practiced. "You look stable," she said with a smirk. He ignored it. "Let's keep this about the deal." She opened her laptop. Of course, but when she spoke, it wasn't just data and projections. It was glances, laughs, old inside jokes repackaged as casual comments. The meeting ended in 35 minutes. "Nice seeing you again, Callan," she said at the door. He didn't respond, but he didn't close the door either. Leora didn't hear much about the meeting. He said it was efficient, standard, that the team was reviewing documents before any next steps. But when she asked if he'd seen her face to face, his tone thinned slightly. She was professional. "That's not what I asked." He didn't look up from his laptop. "Let it go, Leora." She didn't reply, but something in her quiet unsettled him more than any argument would have. The first real shift came 2 weeks later. Leora found a bracelet on the kitchen counter, not hers. Thin gold, minimalist, something Cassandra would wear. Callan said it belonged to his assistant, that she had taken it off during a meeting, that it must have gotten mixed in with his documents. Leora nodded, said nothing, but she stared at it for a long time before placing it in the drawer. The nights grew heavier after that. He stayed later at the office. He didn't sleep as easily. Sometimes she'd walk into the room and he'd minimize his screen. When she asked how work was, he'd say busy and nothing more. Not cruel, not distant, just slightly out of reach. And that, more than anything, is what began to hurt. Not because she didn't trust him, but because he no longer offered his truth freely. One morning, while folding laundry, Leora found a dry cleaning receipt in the pocket of his trousers. Albrecht, silk blouse, gray slacks. She stared at the paper like it had whispered something. They weren't his clothes. He didn't wear silk blouses. She didn't ask about it. Not yet. Instead, she slid it into a drawer beneath her sketch pads. They began orbiting each other differently. The conversations were shorter, the silences longer, and the connection, still present, was being stretched like thread across too much distance. Callan wasn't unkind, but he was elsewhere. And Leora could feel the air changing. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't arrive with a confession or an exposed secret. It slips in through unanswered questions, unspoken doubts, changes in rhythm that no one else hears, but you do, because your heart has memorized every beat of the person next to you. That's what Leora felt, a disruption in pattern, not dramatic, but undeniable. Callan had always been precise, intentional. Even in silence, there was a kind of presence, a steadiness she could lean against. But lately, that steadiness felt staged. The affection remained, but it had changed, like holding a hand that was physically warm but emotionally distant. He would touch her back as she passed him in the hallway, but his eyes were somewhere else. Leora stopped asking where he was going when he left late. Stopped waiting up, not out of defeat, but because she was trying to figure out whether trust meant giving space or confronting discomfort. One night, they were brushing their teeth side by side. She looked over at him, foam around her lips, and asked casually, "Are you still seeing Cassandra?" His motion paused, just for half a second. "Seeing?" he said, rinsing. "No, there's nothing to see. She's a business contact. You've mentioned her 3 times this week. You never used to bring up anyone from your past, because no one else ever showed up in a patent meeting. That's convenient." He turned to her, towel in hand. "What are you really asking?" "I don't know yet." He walked away before she finished drying her hands. It wasn't that he was lying. Not outright. He just wasn't honest, and Leora knew there was a difference. A few days later, she stopped by his office unannounced. It wasn't something she did often, but she brought lunch, fresh pastries from his favorite place near Midtown. She told the receptionist she wouldn't be long. The receptionist smiled politely, but looked unsettled. When Leora stepped off the elevator, Callan's door was open. Cassandra was inside. They weren't touching, nothing inappropriate, but there was closeness, too casual, too comfortable. Leora didn't walk in. She turned around, went back down, and left the pastries on the receptionist's desk. "Tell him I stopped by," she said, smiling faintly. "He'll know why." That evening he came home later than usual. Leora didn't ask. She simply placed dinner on the table and sat quietly across from him. He looked at her, really looked. "You stopped by." She nodded once. "You should have come in. I didn't want to interrupt." His fork hovered in the air. "There's nothing happening, Leora. I didn't say there was. But you think it." "No," she said. "I feel it. And I've never needed proof to trust my gut." He sighed and set his fork down. "You've always trusted me. I still do. But you're not giving me anything to hold on to." That night, he didn't sleep beside her. He said he had emails. She woke at 3:27 a.m. to find him asleep on the couch, laptop open, unread messages flashing on the screen. The next morning, she opened his phone. Not because she wanted to spy, but because there's a point where silence becomes dishonesty. He never changed his passcode. He wasn't hiding anything. Until he was. There was a deleted message thread, only one. The contact name had no number saved, but she knew the tone, the phrasing, the layered manipulation, and the image. An ultrasound photo. She stared at it, blinking. Once, then twice. The message read, "I didn't want to ruin your marriage, but you deserve to know the truth. It's yours, Callan." No emoji, no flourish, just clinical cruelty. Leora's hands went cold. She scrolled. Nothing else, only that. She placed the phone back exactly where it had been and walked to the bathroom. The tears didn't fall, not right away. What came first was the numbness, a kind of emotional freezing, like her body had to prepare for the collapse before it let her feel it. She waited until breakfast. He came in groggy, rubbing his eyes, shirt wrinkled. No tie. Leora placed 2 ultrasound photos on the kitchen counter, his and hers, side by side, one genuine, one in question. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Callan froze. His breath caught. The seconds stretched, heavy with meaning. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. "It was in your deleted folder." He didn't deny it, didn't fumble, didn't lie. "She sent it last week. I didn't respond. Why'd you keep it?" "I didn't know what to do with it." Leora stood still, hands at her sides. "So, you kept it. While you ignored mine. That's not fair, isn't it?" She said she took a test, that she didn't know until recently. "I didn't believe it at first, but..." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "But..." He looked at her with eyes full of something she didn't recognize. "I need time to figure this out." Time, as if the love they'd built didn't deserve certainty, as if her pregnancy, real, growing, present, was equal to a single message from a woman who once turned his life to ash. She didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't cry. She just nodded once, stepped back, and said, "Then take the time. I won't be here when you're done with it. If your heart just dropped like mine did, pause and type, 'Trust us everything' in the comments. And if you think Cassandra is lying, let's expose her together. Smash that like button." He didn't follow her. When she stepped back, placed the ultrasound photos on the counter, and told him she wouldn't wait, he just stood there. His silence said more than any apology ever could. It said, "I'm not sure." It said, "You and I are equal to a maybe." And that was enough for Leora. Not to break, but to leave. She packed slowly. There was no drama, no slamming drawers or rushed sobs. Just quiet decisions made between measured breaths. She folded her favorite sweaters. She boxed her brushes, paints, and journals. She left his cufflinks in the drawer where he'd last placed them, untouched since the night. She gave them back to him during an anniversary dinner he forgot he scheduled over. She didn't leave a note. She did no one. The penthouse felt colder with every step toward the door. This place had been theirs. The framed photo of them in the hallway, the scent of eucalyptus from the candle she always lit on Sunday mornings, the dried lavender above the headboard, all of it had meant something once. Now, it felt like residue, a memory of love he was willing to gamble. She moved into the cottage the next day, the one her grandmother left behind, tucked just far enough from the city to feel like another world. There were no doormen, no skyline views, no imported tiles in the bathroom. But there was peace, and peace when earned through pain, becomes its own kind of wealth. Leora kept her routine simple. Morning tea, a journal entry to the child growing inside her, light stretching, a few hours of remote work for a nonprofit that had offered her a part-time role doing design templates. In the afternoons, she painted. Not commissions, just what she felt. She no longer created to be seen. She created to breathe. She didn't tell many people what had happened. Her father knew something was wrong. He offered to drive up and talk to Callan. She thanked him and said no. Her closest friend, Ellen, called one evening to ask if the rumors were true. Leora only said, "He believed someone else's truth more than mine." That was all she needed to say. At night, she couldn't sleep, not because of loneliness, but because of disbelief, not at what he had done, but at how calmly he'd done it. How a man who once traced her spine with reverence could now be unsure whether her child was real enough to stand beside. How a man who once whispered, "You're my safest place," could choose distance over clarity. She began writing letters to the baby every morning. 1 page, sometimes more. Not always deep, sometimes just details. What she ate, what music she played while painting, what the wind felt like through the kitchen window. But always at the end, she wrote, "You are not a mistake. You are not invisible. I see you." 4 weeks passed. She didn't hear from Callan. No calls, no emails, no texts, no attempt to ask how far along she was, how she was feeling, or whether she needed anything. It was as if, the moment he allowed doubt to enter, she became optional, disposable. She didn't want revenge. She didn't even want justice. She just wanted her name to mean something again, even if only to herself. One morning, she walked to the small post office downtown. Her bank had forwarded a package that had been mistakenly sent to the old address. It was nothing significant, a marketing packet, a few documents, and a sealed envelope addressed in neat handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it at the counter, half distracted. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line. "He's falling for it again." No signature, no return address, just those 6 words. Leora stood frozen, envelope in hand. She reread it 3 times. Her heart didn't race. It slowed, because deep down, some part of her had already known. Some part of her had already grieved. This wasn't just betrayal. It was repetition, a cycle, a man walking back into the very fire she once helped him escape. That night, she lit a candle. She sat in front of a blank canvas, and she painted something she hadn't dared to touch since the day she left. She painted Callan, not the polished man the media photographed, not the version she fell in love with, but the version that looked at her with uncertainty in his eyes, the man who had a choice, and didn't make it in time. When it was done, she didn't sign it. She turned it to the wall and left the room, because it was no longer hers to carry. Callan had expected clarity. He thought stepping away from Leora, temporarily, would give him space to see the situation clearly. It didn't. Instead, everything became louder. Not around him, inside. The silence in the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was confrontational. Every room echoed with her absence. Every chair untouched. Every drawer untouched. Every minute unbothered by her quiet voice or the rustle of her robe in the hallway. He found himself looking for the yellow notes she used to leave in his briefcase. But there was nothing now. Only reminders of what he'd asked for. Space. Cassandra had returned quickly. Too quickly. She stopped by with takeout, claiming she'd just been in the area. She laughed louder than before. She lingered when she touched his arm. She spoke as though they were mid-sentence from a life that no longer existed. At first, Callan brushed it off, but something about her was off. A little too polished. A little too composed. She spoke about the pregnancy in vague terms. Avoided specifics. They sat on his terrace one afternoon. She was drinking mineral water. He asked if she wanted tea. She declined. He stared at her for a moment. "You're 2 months along, right?" She nodded. He hesitated. "That far, and no nausea?" She smiled. "I've been lucky. Not everyone gets sick." He nodded but didn't speak again. The next day, a folder arrived from legal. Routine paperwork for the licensing deal. Inside was a memo with medical clearance notes from Cassandra's side to verify her health status for the pending partnership. He almost skimmed past it. Until he saw the doctor's name, Dr. Weston. Something dropped in his stomach. It was a name from his past, not from hers. Dr. Marissa Weston had been his and Cassandra's fertility specialist. Years ago, back when they were trying, back when Cassandra claimed it was his fault she couldn't conceive. Why would she return to the same clinic? Why that doctor? His hands went cold. He flipped the document again. There was no letterhead, just a scanned note and a vague signature. Something was wrong. That evening, he drove to the clinic. He didn't call ahead, just showed up and asked if he could speak to Dr. Weston. The receptionist recognized him. "She's booked all day. Do you have an appointment?" "No," Callan said, "but it's important. It's about a past patient. Cassandra Albrecht." The receptionist hesitated. "I'm sorry, I can't disclose any information without—" Callan leaned in. "It's not about her, it's about me, and I think I'm being lied to." Something in his voice, strained, hoarse, must have landed because the receptionist finally nodded and disappeared into the back. 5 minutes later, Dr. Weston appeared. Her face was tight with surprise. "Callan." "It's been a while." He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Is she pregnant?" Dr. Weston's expression didn't change, but her voice lowered. "I can't disclose. She's using your name on documents to verify it. That's illegal, and if it's false, I need to know. I have someone else I should have never walked away from. Someone who's actually carrying my child." The doctor didn't speak right away. Then, finally, "Cassandra hasn't been a patient here in over 2 years. He blinked. "But she came once, last fall, not for pregnancy, for hormone therapy. She never followed through. The air left his lungs." He staggered back a step. His chest tightened. "You're sure?" "I'm absolutely sure." Dr. Weston looked at him kindly, but firmly. "You need to be careful who you believe, Callan." He got into his car without a word. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He just sat there, silent, staring, at everything, at nothing. He had destroyed the one person who stood by him. For what? A false image? A woman who'd once betrayed him, and did it again. He didn't even feel rage. Not yet. What he felt was shame. Heavy, deserved. He called Cassandra. She didn't answer. He texted, "We need to talk, now." No response. He drove to her place. She wasn't there. He waited for an hour in his car. Still nothing. When he returned home, something in him had changed. This wasn't about catching her in a lie anymore. It was about reclaiming the part of himself he gave away too easily. The part that believed a whisper over a vow. He opened his closet, found one of Leora's scarves still hanging beside his coats. He reached for it, held it, pressed it to his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he cried. The elevator doors closed behind her for the last time. No suitcase, just a large tote over her shoulder and a box tucked in both arms, one filled with only what mattered. Her journals, the ultrasound photo, and 3 of her favorite brushes wrapped in a towel. Leora didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some places stop being homes the moment you're forced to compete with doubt. The road to the cottage was lined with bare trees and early fall light. It had been her grandmother's. Small sloped roof, slightly uneven flooring, but sturdy and surrounded by quiet. The kind of quiet that used to soothe her. Now, it simply stared back. There were no city horns, no marble countertops, no scent of his cologne in the hallway. Only wood, warmth, and silence that didn't ask for anything. She stepped inside and set the box down by the door. Then she closed it behind her, this time without hesitation. The bedroom had faded curtains. The bed creaked when she sat on it. The sheets smelled faintly of lemon. She had washed them twice before arriving. She didn't unpack right away. She just stood in the center of the room and let her eyes rest on the window. The wind moved softly outside. Inside, nothing moved, except her hand, which unconsciously came to rest on her belly. She was 14 weeks along. The nausea had mostly passed. The bloating came and went, but the ache in her chest, that stayed. Not from the pregnancy, from the decision he made, from how easily he chose uncertainty over presence. That night, she boiled a pot of water and made tea. Sleep didn't come. Her body lay still, but her mind roamed like it was searching for something that refused to be found. She turned on a small lamp and reached for her journal. Instead of writing to herself, she addressed the page to someone else. "Dear little light, you don't know it yet, But you've already saved me. You've reminded me I'm still capable of growing something beautiful in the middle of a season that feels completely barren." She stopped, breathed, and wrote more. By morning, she had written 3 full pages. They weren't poetic or polished, just honest. From that day forward, every morning began with a letter. Not out of ritual, but because it was the only place where her voice felt untouched. Days passed. She bought groceries from the small market in town. The cashier recognized her last name, asked if she was related to Miss Ruth Vale. Leora smiled and said, "Her granddaughter." She left with a small paper bag and 2 unexpected gifts, a bouquet of hand-picked wildflowers, and a handwritten recipe for cornbread, just like her grandmother used to make. She began cleaning the cottage from top to bottom, not because it was messy, but because she needed to reclaim every space. Every drawer she wiped felt like a reset. Every surface she polished became a place she owned, not one she borrowed. The couch sagged a little on one side. She didn't care. She placed her teacup on a mismatched coaster and stared at the fireplace she hadn't lit in years. The calendar on the fridge was still set to a year she could barely remember, one before her heart had learned how much breaking it could survive. In the afternoons, she returned to painting. Not commissions, not requests, just color, movement, feeling. She found an old canvas stored behind the linen closet and stretched it across the table. She dipped the brush in blue and swept it wide. Then gray. Then a warm amber that reminded her of late autumn sun through her grandmother's kitchen window. There was no subject, just freedom. And for the first time in weeks, her chest loosened. At night, she read aloud from the letters she wrote. Not all of them, just the ones that felt like lullabies. You don't have to arrive into a perfect world. You only need to know that when you do, someone already loves you with everything they have left. She would press the pages to her chest, close her eyes, and let sleep carry her gently, without asking for answers. She didn't hear from Callan. Not a message, not a check-in, not even an empty apology pretending to ask how she was. And that silence, as sharp as it was, gave her clarity. If a man could disappear this easily from his own child's beginning, then maybe it was time she stopped expecting him to be part of her ending. She didn't stop loving him overnight, but she stopped depending on him. And sometimes that's even harder. The community center sat just beyond the town library. 2 stories, brick-faced, with faded blue window frames and flyers taped to. Glass doors announcing bake sales, choir nights, and free yoga on Wednesdays. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't funded, but it was needed. And Leora needed something to need her. She walked in on a Thursday. The air smelled like coffee and cleaning solution. A volunteer at the front desk greeted her with tired eyes and a kind smile. "I saw you're looking for part-time teachers," she said. "I'm certified in art instruction, middle grade level." The woman squinted. "Are you Ruth Vale's granddaughter?" Leora nodded. "I took quilting with your grandmother for 10 years, hated sewing, stayed because of her lemon pound cake." They both laughed. By Monday, Leora had a class. 6 students, ages 9 to 13. All quiet at first. 2 of them never made eye contact. One refused to speak at all, but they came back after the first session, and again, and again. She brought sketchbooks, showed them how to mix colors with limited supplies, let them talk if they wanted, or stay silent if they didn't. She taught them that expression didn't have to be pretty to be powerful. They began to trust her, not because she demanded it, but because she didn't. One girl drew her mother every week. Same woman, same face, just different shades of red. One boy scribbled bold lines and called it noise with a name. Leora kept every drawing in a folder labeled Hearts Speaking. She worked mornings, painted in the afternoon, taught twice a week, slept better. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was hers, and that, in itself, felt like a kind of healing. Groceries were simple. Cooking was intentional. Every chore became a ritual of reclaiming. She repaired a loose cabinet hinge with her grandfather's old toolkit, cleaned out the attic and donated what she didn't need, started growing basil on the windowsill just because it reminded her of her grandmother humming while she cooked. No one clapped for her efforts. No one applauded the slow building of peace. But that didn't matter, because every dish washed, every floor swept, every page written to her child. It stitched her back together. She no longer waited for Callan's number to flash on her screen. She no longer checked his social updates, no longer refreshed news sites to see if his company had announced anything new. Letting go wasn't a one-time choice. It was 100 small ones, repeated daily. Ellen visited one weekend with a bag of groceries and 2 days' worth of gossip from the city. "I thought you'd be in sweats and surrounded by tissues," Ellen said, scanning the tidy cottage. "I was," Leora replied. "Then I ran out of tissues." They laughed, then cried, then made tea, and didn't talk about Callan until well into the second day. "He's quiet," Ellen finally said. "Too quiet. The kind that looks like shame, not peace." Leora stirred honey into her mug. "I don't need his noise anymore." After Ellen left, Leora opened her journal again. "Dear little light, today someone told me I look stronger. I didn't know I looked weak. But maybe I did. Maybe I still do. Maybe strength is less about how others see you, and more about how you stand up when no one is watching." Her doctor's appointment was 2 weeks later. Routine checkup, measurements, lab work. The nurse placed the cold gel on her belly and adjusted the monitor. A moment later, there it was. The sound, a steady rhythm, alive, present, the heartbeat, strong, reliable, nothing like the man who had walked away from it. Leora didn't cry, not this time. She smiled, not for the nurse, not for the doctor, but for herself, because for the first time since the betrayal, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt like she was building, and that's where real strength lives, not in pretending you're fine, but in choosing to keep going, even when you're not. Leora hadn't intended to become someone people admired. She wasn't trying to impress. She wasn't performing resilience, but people noticed anyway. At the community center, they started calling her Miss Vale, not as a formality, but as a kind of respect. She carried herself with calm, not the calm that came from peace, but the kind that comes after you've walked through chaos and chosen not to stay there. One morning, she arrived early for her class and found a small card taped to the door. "Your class helped my daughter smile again. Thank you." No name, just handwriting, slanted, unsteady. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside her journal. At the small farmer's market on Saturdays, vendors started giving her extra fruit, slipping an extra tomato into her bag without asking. She always paid anyway, not because she had to, but because she wanted to remain grounded in exchange, not charity. One afternoon, while reorganizing a shelf at the cottage, she found an old sketch she had done of Callan's hands. She'd drawn them the second week he started showing up at the cabin, not to flatter, but to understand. Even then, something in his touch had been both controlled and uncertain. She stared at it for a long time, then tore it in half, folded the pieces together, placed them in the fireplace. Healing didn't come in waves. It came in details, choosing to get dressed, even when she could have stayed in bed, watering the basil every morning, even when it didn't seem to grow, replying to emails, turning off her phone at night, stretching her legs when her back ached from pregnancy. These weren't dramatic acts, but they were decisions, and they mattered. At her next doctor's visit, her iron levels were low. She adjusted her meals, added spinach, took her supplements without forgetting. She listened to her body, and, for the first time in her adult life, she didn't put someone else's needs above her own. Ellen sent her a message after seeing a clip of the community art class online. "You look like someone who's coming home to herself." Leora read it 3 times. She didn't reply right away. Later, she typed, "That's the only home I ever really needed." She received an email from the gallery that had once turned her away. They had seen her recent work posted through the community center's newsletter and asked if she'd be interested in showcasing a few pieces for their fall event. Leora stared at the screen, not because she doubted her talent, but because for the first time she realized she didn't need their approval anymore. Still, she said yes, not to be seen, but to share. Her most recent painting was called Still Standing. It wasn't loud, just layers of soft brushwork, bruised purples, muted golds, deep browns that bled into each other like long-forgotten apologies. At the center was a silhouette, not full-bodied, just enough to suggest presence. No name, no face, just strength that existed, quietly. She read somewhere that grief doesn't ask permission before showing up, but neither does clarity. And lately, Leora was beginning to see everything more clearly, not just Callan, but herself. He had disappeared. That much was clear. Not physically, She had no interest in tracking his location, but emotionally he had chosen the silence, and she had learned to stop filling it for him. She lit candles at night. Sometimes she wrote, sometimes she didn't, but every evening she placed a hand over her belly and whispered something small. "We are okay. You are loved. I will not let the way he left define the way you arrive." And that was the promise she intended to keep, whether he ever showed up again or not. The weeks blurred, but not in the way they used to. Time used to vanish inside calendars full of boardroom dinners, polite small talk, and pretending she wasn't slowly disappearing into someone else's shadow. Now, time passed gently, fully. Each morning was marked by the sound of the kettle. Each evening, by the turn of a page in her journal. The world was smaller, yes, but it was hers. The pregnancy moved into its final trimester. Her body ached in new ways. The quiet cottage, once a haven, now creaked more in the night. The floors, the windows, the wind pressing against the eaves. They all whispered things she tried not to hear. But she didn't let fear grow roots. She installed a security light, bought a baby monitor with long-range audio, moved the crib into her room, not because she expected danger, but because safety wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a promise. She changed the locks one afternoon, not because she thought Callan would come back, but because if he ever did, he wouldn't be able to walk in as though he never left. The cottage wasn't a memory. It was a boundary now. The letters to her unborn daughter became shorter, more focused. Less about the past, more about the future. "You're already brave. You teach me things I never knew I had the strength to learn. I don't know what the world will hand you, but I do know this. My love is not conditional. It doesn't run. It stays." The baby kicked more now. Some days, it startled her. Some days, it calmed her. It was a rhythm she'd come to trust more than any vow she'd ever been given. The final art class of the season came with handmade cards from the kids. One card had a drawing of Leora holding a bright yellow star. The caption, "You are our light." She sat in her car for 10 minutes after the session, not crying, just breathing. The gallery confirmed her submission for fall. They wanted Still Standing as the featured piece for the opening night. She sent in a bio, Leora Vale, teaching artist. Advocate for emotional expression through creative healing. No mention of her last name by marriage. No mention of the company her husband once led. That woman, the one who lived in penthouses and planned dinner parties, didn't belong to her anymore. One night, the power went out. The storm had knocked a transformer somewhere near the hills. She lit candles, sat by the window, watched the shadows flicker across the wooden walls. Not a single part of her wished for company. Not because she didn't feel alone, but because she had finally made peace with her own presence. She touched her stomach, whispered aloud, "You'll never have to question if you were wanted. Even when he left, I stayed. Even when it hurt, I loved you anyway." A knock came once, late, sharp, 3 quick taps. She froze. No one should be out here this late. Not on this road, not in this weather. But it wasn't him. Just the neighbor's boy had found her mailbox flag down and thought it looked broken. Said he'd fix it tomorrow. She smiled, thanked him, closed the door, locked it again. She made a cup of warm milk, sat back at her desk, opened a new page in her journal, wrote one line, "I am no longer waiting to be saved," because she had already done it herself, every day, without apology, without audience, without him. Callan had always prided himself on clarity, facts, numbers, contracts, timelines. That's where he lived, not feelings. But lately, nothing made sense. Cassandra had moved through his life again with familiar ease, her laugh in meetings, her perfume left on files, her voice lingering after she left the room. It all felt rehearsed, too easy, too neat. And yet, he had let her in. It started small. A calendar alert for an appointment she didn't remember making. "I must have booked it while half asleep," she said, brushing it off with a soft smile. He nodded. But he didn't delete it. Then came the phone call, a billing inquiry from a clinic. "Ms. Albrecht has missed her check-in with Dr. Weston's office. Should we reschedule?" Callan's stomach went tight. Dr. Weston. The name hit like ice. That was the same specialist they had visited years ago, back when he and Cassandra were still together, desperate and failing to conceive. Why would she be seeing him now? Wasn't she already under care elsewhere? He didn't say anything to her that night. Just watched. A few days later, Cassandra mentioned feeling sick again. She held her lower back and winced dramatically during dinner. "Baby's growing," she said. "You wouldn't believe how fast they develop at this stage." She slid her phone over the table, a new ultrasound image. Callan stared at it. The fetus looked off, not in a medical way, but in the way that made him feel like he'd seen it before. He asked her the date of the scan. She told him, smiled, but the timestamp in the corner didn't match. It had been cropped, and poorly. He didn't say anything, but his silence was no longer passive. He started checking things. Quietly, he reviewed hospital bills through their shared expense account. Some were real, some didn't exist at all. A consultation she claimed to attend? No record. A prescription refill? Wrong dosage for a pregnant woman. Callan sat in his office one night, surrounded by printed pages and dates, and screenshots, his fingers pressed to his temples like a vice. He'd built a billion-dollar empire by spotting flaws, false reports, inflated data. So why hadn't he seen this? He picked up his phone, called Dr. Weston's private line, a connection he still had from years ago. "Callan." The doctor answered, surprised. "Everything all right?" Callan's voice was low, steady. "I need to ask something personal." "Off the record." Dr. Weston paused, then said carefully, "Go ahead. Has Cassandra Albrecht been seeing you recently, under prenatal care?" A pause. Then the soft rustle of shuffled papers. "No, I haven't seen Cassandra in at least 4 years. We did a few cycles back then, but she didn't return after the final consult." Callan's chest hollowed. "She hasn't been in your office?" "No, and I'd remember. We have to record every patient visit. There's no record." Callan thanked him, hung up. He didn't move for a long time. Not until his phone buzzed with a message from Cassandra. "Thinking about dinner? Baby wants sushi." He looked at the message, at the emoji, at the lie. The weight of what he had done to Leora crashed into him like a collapse. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by silent screens and discarded receipts, and whispered to no one, "What have I done?" Comment exposed if you saw that lie coming. And if you think karma just clapped back, share this story with someone who needs to hear the truth. Always wins. Callan didn't say anything the next morning. Not right away. He played along. Let her talk. Let her weave. She told him about a nursery theme she liked. Neutral colors, forest animals, a moon-shaped mobile. She laughed as she showed him pictures. Claimed she already ordered it all. He nodded. Sipped his coffee. She didn't notice his hands trembling just slightly. "Why haven't you invited me to any of your appointments?" he asked, gently, as she scrolled through her phone. Cassandra didn't miss a beat. "You've been so busy with the board transition. I didn't want to stress you." Callan leaned back, watched her, waited. She met his gaze with that familiar softness, the same softness that had once convinced him to sign over access to accounts, to trust her again. But now, it didn't soothe. It set him on edge. Later that day, he sent an assistant to the medical office she claimed to visit. There was no record of her, no patient file. She had never stepped foot in the building. He printed the proof, put it in a folder. Next to it, he added the edited ultrasound, a copy of the fake bill, the text from the fertility clinic confirming her absence. It felt like building a legal case against someone he once thought he might marry. And maybe that's exactly what he was doing. That night, she walked into the apartment humming, placed a takeout bag on the counter. "Thai tonight. Your favorite?" Callan didn't touch it. He opened the folder, set it on the counter between them. She frowned. "What's that?" "Proof." Her smile faltered. "Proof of what?" "That you're not pregnant." Silence stretched across the kitchen. Cassandra's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked unsure. "I talked to Weston," Callan said quietly. She blinked. Her hands, always graceful, suddenly looked clumsy resting on the counter. "He hasn't seen you. There's no record of any prenatal care. You used old scan images and cropped them. You created false bills and sent them through our expense account under dummy provider names." Still, she said nothing. She just stared. Callan stepped forward. What was the plan, Cassandra? She opened her mouth, then closed it, and finally smiled, but it wasn't the same smile. This one was tired, cracked around the edges. I didn't think you'd actually walk out on her, she said. The voice was calm, matter of fact. Callan's heart dropped. You lied, and you didn't even believe it would work? She shrugged slightly. It was a test. His stomach turned. A test? I wanted to see if you still believed in us. If the man I knew was still buried under all that humility your wife tried to teach you. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a calculation. I gave you a way out, she said. You took it. That's not on me. Callan shook his head slowly. You cost me everything. She walked over to the sink, poured herself water, and sipped it like they were discussing something as casual as traffic. You didn't lose her because of me, she said flatly. You lost her because some part of you still wanted to believe I mattered. That's on you, Callan. He stared at her, at the woman who once held his trust, who had nearly destroyed him once and had done it again. But this time, she hadn't fooled him. She had exposed him to himself. She walked toward the door, heels clicking against the tile. You'll be fine, she said. You always land on your feet. He didn't respond, didn't stop her, didn't ask where she was going. He just watched the door close behind her and sat down, alone, again. But this time, the loneliness wasn't the worst part. It was the knowledge that the silence was earned. For 2 hours after Cassandra left, Callan sat alone, not in his office, not in the living room. He sat on the floor, right where Leora used to read, the space where her voice once filled the air with bedtime stories from old books and late-night conversations over herbal tea. Now, there was nothing but static in his chest. He reached for his phone, opened her contact, stared. Not a single message had been sent in over 5 months. The last from her read, You don't have to believe me, but you owe our child honesty. Whatever you decide next, decide carefully. He hadn't replied. At the time, he had been too filled with doubt, with pride, with the belief that staying away was a responsible pause. Now he realized it was abandonment. He typed, erased, typed again. But what could he possibly say? Sorry would insult the silence she had already survived. So he closed the phone, put it face down, and walked to the nursery. It was half built, a crib in a box, sheets still folded. The room had waited, but the child it was meant for wasn't Cassandra's. That child, the real one, was growing somewhere else, alone. A flash of memory struck him like cold water. Leora laughing as she painted tiny ducks on a wall. Leora whispering dreams in her sleep, curled beside him, unaware that he had already begun drifting from her emotionally before his feet ever walked out that door. He had walked away from that. He had let a ghost trick him out of a future that was real. He walked through each room of the penthouse slowly, touching nothing, just listening. For her footsteps, for her laughter, for her forgiveness. None came. At midnight, he pulled out the folder again, laid each piece of false evidence across the table. Photos, faked records, time-stamped lies, but it wasn't the proof of Cassandra's schemes that broke him. It was the reflection of who he had become that did. He remembered the first time Leora held his hand during one of his panic attacks. She didn't say a word. She just squeezed once and held on. He had felt safe then. Now, he was surrounded by concrete and silence and the echo of his own arrogance. He opened the desk drawer. Inside was a card, one of Leora's old handwritten notes. She used to leave them tucked into his planner. This one said, You don't have to be perfect, just honest, just present. That's enough for me. His throat tightened. He read it again, then again. And for the first time in years, Callan Varelli cried without shame. Not out of heartbreak, out of responsibility, because now he saw what he'd done. Not just to her, to himself. To the version of him she believed in. And he had buried under ego. He called a car, told his assistant to clear his schedule indefinitely, and before the sun came up, he packed a bag. Not to fix what was broken, but to finally face it. The road to Leora's cottage wasn't long, but it felt like a lifetime. Callan stared out the car window as streetlights blurred past, his reflection staring back in fragmented flashes. He thought about everything he would say, How he would begin. How to tell the woman he left mid-pregnancy that her instincts were right all along, and that his silence wasn't because he didn't care. It was because shame had made a home in him. The car pulled to a stop just before the gravel path. He didn't ask the driver to wait, didn't know if he'd be welcomed in or sent away without a word. Either way, he owed her this. He owed her the truth. The cottage light was on, not bright, just a warm flicker spilling from the kitchen window. He stood there for a second, taking in the quiet. It was the opposite of the life he knew. High-rises, meetings, noise. But it was the only place that had ever felt like home. Because she was there, Callan stepped onto the porch, heart loud in his ears. The wind nudged leaves across the steps. He raised his hand to knock, but the door opened before he could. She had seen his shadow on the walk. Leora stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other resting against the curve of her stomach. She was glowing, not in the poetic way people toss around when describing pregnancy, but in the grounded, untouchable kind of strength that comes from surviving what should have broken you. He forgot every word he'd rehearsed. She didn't speak, didn't move, just looked at him. He finally found his voice. "I know everything now." No response. "I should have trusted you. I should have believed you. I should have never—" She held up her hand. Quiet, sharp, final. "Do you think knowing the truth now changes what you did?" she asked. Her voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't even cold. It was factual. Callan swallowed hard. "No. It doesn't." He looked down. "I came to say I'm sorry, but not because I think it will fix anything. I just need you to know you were never the mistake." A long silence followed, the kind that presses on your ribs. Leora stepped forward slightly, close enough that he could smell the chamomile from her skin, the same scent that used to linger on his pillow. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then said, "You didn't just leave me, Callan. You left our daughter before she even had a chance to meet you." That hit harder than any accusation could. It knocked the breath from his lungs. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse into him like a movie scene. She stood there, full of grace and gravity, and reminded him, not of what she had lost, but of what he had thrown away. "I won't stop you from being a father," she said, "but you will not come back into this house, thinking one apology covers months of absence." He nodded, lips pressed together, swallowing the pain. "I understand." She looked down the path behind him, then back at him. "Go home, Callan." His heart clenched. He had no home anymore. Not really. But he turned anyway. Because what she needed now wasn't a man groveling at her door. It was space to protect what she'd built in his absence. As he walked back down the steps, her voice reached him one more time. "When our daughter asks about you, I'll tell her the truth." He turned slightly, not expecting more, but she finished anyway. "That you didn't show up when it was easy. You showed up when it was hard. And that matters too." He blinked hard, nodded once, then disappeared into the dark. This time, not as a man who gave up, but as one who finally understood the weight of what he left behind. If your heart just dropped like mine did, pause and type "exposed" in the comments. And if you think karma just clapped back, share this story with someone who needs to hear the truth always wins. It had been over 6 weeks since he stood at her doorstep last. Since then, Callan hadn't called, hadn't sent gifts, no desperate gestures or dramatic messages, only space, respectful silence. It was the first time in his life that he had nothing to offer but humility, and it turned out that was the only thing worth bringing. Now, he stood at the edge of the same gravel path, hands in his coat pockets. There was no rehearsed speech this time, no expectation, only a question in his heart. Would she even open the door again? The sun was low, casting gentle amber light across the porch. A wind chime moved faintly, its sound soft, almost private. As he reached the step, the door creaked open. She was already there, holding a mug of tea. No surprise in her eyes. No softness either, but no bitterness, only composure. "Twice in one lifetime," she said. He gave a tight smile. "I'm not here to fix anything." "Good." She stepped aside. "Come in, but just for a few minutes. I have somewhere to be." He stepped inside slowly. Everything looked the same, but he didn't. She noticed it right away. His posture was quieter. His suit gone, replaced by a worn jacket and eyes that had learned to sit in discomfort without needing to be rescued. "Thank you," he said, as she handed him a cup. "I didn't make that for you," she replied plainly, "but I'll let you borrow it." He nodded, took a sip, let the warmth settle into his chest, like a second chance he knew better than to name. "I stepped down from the company," he said quietly. "Sold my shares, donated most of it." Her expression didn't change. "Why are you really here, Callan?" He paused, swallowed hard. "Because I couldn't move forward without facing what I broke. I came to say what I didn't have the courage to before." He looked up, eyes glossy but steady. "I'm sorry, not for what I lost, but for what I took from you, from her, from all three of us." Leora set her tea down. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it live there between them. Then she said, "You're not the man I married." He nodded. "I know. You're also not the man who walked out that night." His throat tightened. "But neither of those versions of you matter to me now, because I'm not the woman who waited at that window wondering if you'd come back." She stood taller, not from pride, from peace, from the kind of strength that had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "I forgive you," she said. His breath caught. "But I'm not inviting you back into my life to repay a debt. This isn't about redemption. It's about boundaries." He nodded slowly. "I understand." She looked at the time. "I need to go," she said. "My class starts in 20 minutes. He stood, setting the cup down gently. "Thank you for letting me in, even for this moment." Leora opened the door for him. But before he left, he turned. "I'm not coming back unless you ask me to." She met his gaze. Calm, final, good. And with that, she closed the door, not with resentment, not with anger, but with the authority of a woman who had survived disappointment and didn't fear it anymore. The door clicked shut behind him. Leora stood for a moment, hand still on the knob, not because she was second-guessing, but because it felt good to choose not to chase, to choose herself. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was earned, built from sleepless nights, early mornings, and moments no one else had seen, not even Callan. She walked into the small nursery where sunlight painted soft gold across the wooden floor. Arya's crib stood by the window. The mobile she'd made from scraps of thread and watercolor paper spun slowly. Her world wasn't perfect, but it was hers, rooted, real. She sat in the rocking chair beside the crib and picked up her journal. Another letter to her daughter, this one not drenched in grief or questions. This one was steady. "My brave girl. Today, he came back, not to rescue us, but to return something, the truth. And I didn't need it to stand tall. I was already upright. I hope one day you understand that people will disappoint you, even the ones you love. But that doesn't mean you shrink. It means you grow in directions they may never follow." She paused, smiled to herself, not bitterly, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned to stand in her own light. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lainey, her coworker at the community center. "The kids are already asking about your art lesson. We miss you here." Leora stood, grabbed her tote bag, and tucked her journal inside. Before stepping out, she glanced at the mirror by the door. She barely recognized herself, in the best way, not because she looked different, but because she felt different, like a woman who had outgrown the version of herself who waited on permission to feel whole. As she locked the cottage behind her, she breathed in the air with no hurry, no weight pressing down. Her story didn't need fixing. It needed living. And that's exactly what she was doing. At the community center, the children swarmed her with crayons and excitement. She laughed, a real, unguarded sound, and rolled up her sleeves. Paint on her hands felt more honest than diamonds ever had. One little girl tugged on her sleeve and asked, "Miss Leora, how do you always stay happy?" She knelt beside her. "I'm not always happy," she said, "but I am always honest with my heart, and that helps me stay true." The girl tilted her head. "That's cool. Can we draw lines today?" Leora grinned. "Absolutely." Callan didn't come back the next week, or the one after that. He didn't send flowers, didn't leave notes, didn't ask to be seen. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that love wasn't owed, it was earned. Quietly, without expectation. Instead, he enrolled in a parenting class, the kind with hard chairs and fluorescent lights where single mothers exchanged. Knowing looks and teen dads sat scrolling through their phones. He showed up anyway, week after week, sat in the back, took notes, listened more than he spoke. The instructor, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Haynes, asked once, "Where's the mother?" Callan simply replied, "She's raising our daughter. I'm just trying to rise to the level she already lives on." Mrs. Haynes didn't say much, but from that day forward, she always greeted him with a nod of respect. He started volunteering anonymously, donating art supplies to local centers under Leora's name. He didn't put his face on anything, didn't use it as currency. He just gave, to balance the ledger he once ignored. At night, he'd drive past the cottage, not to intrude, just to make sure the lights were on. It wasn't stalking, it was reverence. He never stayed more than a few seconds, just long enough to remind himself of the peace he'd once been part of. And broken, back at his apartment, now modest, a far cry from the penthouse, he read parenting books, watched documentaries about child development, practiced folding onesies he never got to buy, and each time he folded them, he whispered, "Aria, I'm trying." One afternoon, he visited an old artist's market in the city, a place Leora once mentioned loving in passing. There, he bought a tiny hand-bound book with blank pages. He didn't know why at first, but later that night, he began to write. Not letters to win her back, not excuses, but thoughts, reflections, things he wished he'd said when it still counted. On the cover, he wrote 3 words in quiet pen. For her light, the envelope was cream-colored, plain, and unaddressed. It was slipped beneath Leora's cottage door on a Saturday morning while she and Aria were still sleeping. No knock, no name, just stillness. She found it an hour later, as the kettle whistled and the baby stirred. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not typed, not dramatic, just handwriting, his. "I won't ask to be forgiven. I just want you to know I finally understand. You didn't just carry a child. You carried us. And when I dropped everything you held together, you didn't fall. You stood. This paper swan is made from the first letter you ever wrote me, the one you slipped into my briefcase before my Tokyo pitch. You ended it with, 'Even when you can't see me, I'm on your side.' I never told you, but I kept it, folded it and unfolded it 100 times. Now I'm giving it back, because you were never behind me. You were ahead, and I was too blind to follow." Leora read it once, then again, then set it on the counter beside the baby monitor. She didn't cry. There was no need. This was not a plea, not a performance, just a page, and that was enough. She walked outside with Aria wrapped against her chest. The trees were losing their leaves, just beginning to whisper the hush of winter. She breathed deep, looked up. The world didn't owe her clarity, but it had finally given her quiet. That night, Leora sat down in her studio space and opened a new canvas. Not to paint pain, but possibility. The paper swan sat folded beside her tea mug, no longer a relic, now a reminder that even people who failed you once can learn how to show up, not to take space, but to honor it. She reached for her pen and began to write a new letter, not for Aria this time, not for Callan, for herself. You don't owe softness to those who broke you, but you can still be kind. And if someone truly learns, truly shows up without reward, you're allowed to see them again, not for who they were, but for who they've become. She sealed the letter and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. It didn't need sending. It just needed to be said. The next morning, she placed the paper swan on the windowsill above Aria's crib and whispered 2 words she hadn't said in months. Thank you, not to him, to herself. The hospital room was quiet, but not the kind of silence that felt empty. This was sacred, the kind of hush that wrapped itself around pain and joy at once, the kind that held space for every breath, every contraction, every moment. Leora felt her body tear itself open to bring new life forward. She gripped the bed rails, her fingers cold, her voice raw from hours of labor. Sweat drenched her hair. The nurse whispered something kind, but Leora couldn't hear it. All she could hear was her heartbeat and the steady, determined rhythm of her daughter fighting to be born. 12 hours in, her strength was wearing thin, but she had known pain before, and this time she wasn't afraid of it. The final push came with a cry so deep it didn't just escape her, it released her. And then, a sound, not hers, smaller, fiercer, more primal, a baby's cry. Aria. Leora collapsed back onto the pillows, tears streaking down her face, equal parts agony and awe. The nurse placed the baby against her chest, and for the first time since Callan walked out, for the first time since Cassandra's lie cracked her world open, Leora felt whole again. She looked into the tiny face curled against her and whispered, "I promised I'd never let you feel alone. Welcome home, my light." They kept her for 3 days. She didn't ask for visitors. She didn't need them. She and Aurea had each other, and that was enough. Each hour felt like a page being written, each feeding a vow, each midnight lullaby a quiet anthem of rebirth. Leora wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming. Back at the cottage, she cleared out the corner room that once held her old canvases and journals. She turned it into something new, part nursery, part studio, part sanctuary. There was a chair by the window, a sound recorder on the desk, a shelf full of blank journals, and above it she hung a sign she had painted by hand, "Letters to Aurea," because healing was meant to be heard, and she was ready to speak. Leora's first recording wasn't perfect. She stuttered once, paused too long between sentences, fumbled with the mic settings and had to start over twice, but none of that mattered, because when she pressed record, she meant every word. "Dear Aurea, if you ever wonder how strong you are, just remember this. You were born from heartbreak, but raised in hope. Your story began in a moment of silence, but I promise, my love, it will never stay quiet." She didn't script the episode. She just spoke about fear, about choice, about loving someone who left, and learning how to stay for yourself. She talked like a mother, like a woman still healing, and like a friend who understood the ache people carry when no one is watching. When she uploaded the first episode of Letters to Aurea, she didn't expect much. Maybe a few listeners, maybe a stranger who needed to know they weren't alone. She turned off her laptop and went to bed. By morning, the inbox was flooded. Hundreds of messages. Subject lines like, "This felt like it was written for me. I cried with you. Please don't stop." A woman from Minnesota wrote, "I haven't spoken to my daughter in 3 years. Your voice made me pick up the phone." Another from Ghana, "I played this for my niece. She's going through a divorce." We both sat in silence. Then we held hands and wept. Leora read each one, not with pride, but with reverence. She hadn't set out to build an audience. She had just chosen to be honest. And in a world full of filtered lives and polished lies, honesty was oxygen. She committed to 1 episode a week. Short letters, small stories, big truth. Each one ended the same way. You are more than what broke you. You are becoming something unshakable. By the 3rd month, a journalist picked up the podcast and wrote an article titled, "This Mother's Voice is Healing the Internet." The piece went viral. Downloads skyrocketed. Sponsors called. She declined most, not because she wasn't grateful, but because this wasn't a brand. It was her heartbeat. She gave a rare interview, and when asked what she hoped the podcast would become, she simply said, "A safe place to land. For anyone carrying a quiet kind of pain, if Leora's strength inspires you, hit the share button. Let's make sure this message reaches someone who needs to hear, you are never powerless." The letters kept coming. From women in shelters, from teenage girls who didn't know their worth, from men, quiet, trembling, saying they'd never told anyone what they carried until now. One wrote, "I lost my sister last year. I listened to your podcast in my car, and for 20 minutes a week I feel like she's still here." Another, "I forgave my mother, not because she asked, but because I heard you forgive someone who never did." Leora didn't respond to every message. She couldn't, but she read them. She felt them, and she wove their pain into every new letter she recorded. A popular book club featured her podcast. Then a therapist in Toronto made it part of her group healing curriculum. A celebrity reposted a quote. Suddenly, Letters to Aurea wasn't just a podcast. It was a movement. She created a small team, not for fame, but to protect the intimacy of what they were building. They didn't add background music. They didn't chase algorithms. They didn't produce content. They made space for truth. Her inbox became a gallery of testimonies. "I left the person who hit me. I started painting again after 10 years. My daughter and I talk every Friday now. We listen to your episodes together." The podcast didn't fix people. It reminded them they weren't broken beyond repair. What shocked Leora most wasn't the scale. It was how deeply people wanted to heal, if someone gave them permission. She never told anyone what to do. She just told her story. and somehow that gave others the courage to tell theirs. She was invited to speak on panels, to conferences, to mental health summits. She accepted a few. But her favorite stage remained the same, that quiet room next to her daughter's crib where a mic waited and a journal opened, where she still began every letter the same way, Dear Aurea. Because even as the world listened, Leora never forgot who she was writing for. Aurea turned one on a crisp autumn morning. There was no extravagant party, just a blanket in the backyard, a tiny cake with a single candle, and the sound of birds overhead. Leora watched her daughter crawl across the grass, giggling, her curls bouncing with every movement. It struck her then. She was no longer the woman who clutched an ultrasound photo with trembling hands. She was someone reborn. That night, after Aurea fell asleep, Leora sat in her studio, mic blinking red. She held the latest letter, but paused before reading. Tonight, she whispered, I don't want to talk about heartbreak. I want to talk about power. She spoke about growth, about choice, about how healing doesn't always look like moving on. It often looks like rooting in. About how peace isn't passive. It's a decision, a practice. She ended the episode with a challenge. If you're listening, I dare you to bloom where you were broken, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself you were always more than what they left behind. The next morning, thousands had already responded. Messages poured in tagged letters to Aurea Challenge. People posting journal entries, poems, photos of quiet, ordinary triumphs. Months passed, then a year, and Leora was asked to publish a book. Not a memoir, but a collection of the letters, with reflections from her listeners interwoven. She titled it simply, Becoming Light. It debuted at first, not because of marketing, but because people recognized truth when they saw it. She started visiting high schools, women's shelters, libraries in small towns. Sometimes she brought Aurea. Other times she brought silence and let others speak. And every time she stepped off the stage, someone would whisper, Thank you for surviving out loud. Leora wasn't just heard. She was felt. And in becoming herself fully, she gave the world permission to do the same. Callan didn't return to the penthouse. He didn't step back into the boardroom. He didn't reach for press releases or public statements. He disappeared, but not to run. He retreated to rebuild. The first step was resignation. Varelli Innovations released a quiet statement. Founder and CEO, Callan Varelli, steps down to focus on personal matters. No headlines, no scandal. Just a man letting go of a title he once clung to like armor. Therapy wasn't his assistant's suggestion. It wasn't a PR move. It was desperation. He sat across from a therapist 3 days after discovering Cassandra's deception, not to unpack the lie, but to unpack why he'd believed it. I let a ghost cost me everything real, he confessed in one session. Because I was too proud to believe someone like Leora could be permanent. I was waiting for her to leave, so I beat her to it. There were no breakthroughs in the first few weeks, just stillness, then shame, then slowly, self-awareness. He started attending group parenting classes, the kind where fathers sat awkwardly on mats, bouncing plastic dolls and learning how to swaddle. No one recognized him. He didn't talk much, but he listened. He listened to men speak about fear, about wanting to be more present than their fathers ever were. He watched them cry, laugh, change, and he thought of Aurea. He donated his Varelli stock quietly and used the funds to create something Leora would never expect. Art therapy centers, one in Atlanta, 3 more in cities where funding for youth mental health was disappearing. He named the first one Aurea House, a safe space for children who needed to speak through color before they had the courage to speak through words. He never told Leora, not because he wanted her praise, but because some things were better done in silence. Every month, he mailed a letter addressed to his daughter, never sent to the cottage. He kept them in a small wooden box in his apartment, each one a quiet promise. I'm learning how to love without needing control. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known. You have her fire. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope to become someone you're proud of. Callan did not beg his way back. He earned the right to stay in the background until she led him forward. Leora didn't notice the envelope on the porch right away. She had just come back from the community center, Aurea in one arm, grocery bag in the other. The day had been long. Her podcast inbox was flooded, her classes overbooked, and her sleep rare. It wasn't until nightfall that she saw it, resting just beneath the doormat, a pale cream envelope, hand addressed in careful strokes. No postage, just her name. She didn't open it immediately. She set it on the kitchen counter and let it sit there like a question she wasn't ready to answer. But curiosity has a pulse, and grief has memory. So that night, after Arya fell asleep against her chest, she reached for the envelope. Inside was a single object, a paper swan, folded neatly, precisely, beautifully, from a page she instantly recognized. One of her letters. Not just any letter. The one she had written during her 3rd trimester, when the loneliness was heaviest, and the baby kicked like she was trying to comfort her from the inside. The letter had said, "Love isn't a promise you make once. It's a choice you make every day, even after the storm." Leora held the paper bird in her palm, her thumb brushing its folded wing. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It was intentional. She turned the swan over. On the base, in faint pencil, was a note. "I didn't know how to hold you back then, but I've spent every day learning how to hold space for you now. See." That night, she didn't cry from hurt. She cried because for the first time, his actions finally felt quiet enough for her pain to be heard. And that meant everything. They didn't speak for 2 weeks after the paper swan arrived. Leora didn't know what to say. Callan didn't ask for more. He had learned finally that love wasn't a chase. It wasn't about winning someone back. It was about showing up, even if the door never opened. But one evening, Leora sent a message. "I'm taking Arya to the park tomorrow, 3 p.m. If you're free, you can come." There was no punctuation, no smiley face, just a thread. And still, he showed up. Not in a suit, not bearing flowers. Just him, holding a paperback on parenting and a stuffed giraffe tucked under his arm. He didn't rush to her. He greeted Arya first, gentle, present, grounded. They spent an hour on that park bench, not reliving what broke them, but witnessing who they had become. "You don't owe me anything," he said at one point, voice steady. "I know," she replied, watching Arya toddle across the grass. "But I wanted you to know. I'm proud of you, not as someone who used to be your husband, but as someone who still believes in the woman you are." Her throat tightened, but she didn't break, not yet. It wasn't until days later, standing by Arya's crib as her daughter giggled in her sleep, that it hit her. She wasn't angry anymore. The ache had shifted. It wasn't sharp. It was soft. It didn't demand revenge. It sought peace. So she picked up her phone and typed, "I forgive you. Not because you earned it, but because I need to move forward without bitterness dragging behind me." Forgiveness didn't come wrapped in a bow. There was no romantic music, no kiss in the rain. There was clarity. There was truth. There was a woman choosing peace over poison. And for the first time in a long time, Leora felt light. The air was still, not heavy, just quiet, as if the world had paused to listen. A soft rustle of branches overhead. The willow tree stood tall, graceful, its limbs swaying like they were blessing what was about to unfold beneath them. Leora stood in a flowing cream dress. No veil, no fanfare, just truth. In her arms, Arya gurgled, one tiny fist wrapped around the edge of her mother's scarf. Callan waited just a few steps away, hands slightly trembling. He wasn't nervous, he was humbled. A small circle of people stood around them, not executives, not curated guests, just the ones who mattered. Neighbors, community center friends, podcast listeners who had traveled miles just to witness this quiet ceremony of healing. When it was time, Callan didn't read his vows from a card. He looked at her, heart wide open, and spoke with no theatrics. "I once thought love was a prize you earned, something you bought, built, or deserved. But standing here, I know now. Love is a choice, every single day. I didn't choose you enough when it mattered most. I let my past blind me, but I've spent every moment since choosing the kind of man I'd want Arya to remember. I'm not here to ask you to forget. I'm here to promise this. Every day I get to stand near you, I will earn my place, not through grand gestures, but quiet presence, real presence." Arya babbled right after he finished. It made everyone laugh, Leora too. Her turn. She passed Arya to her sister and stepped closer, steady but soft. "I used to believe love was enough, that if you gave it fully, it would protect you. But love isn't a shield, it's a mirror. And for a while, all it showed me was my pain. But now, I see something else. I see how far we've come, not as the woman who was abandoned, but as the woman who chose herself first and let healing guide her back to truth. I forgive you, but more importantly, I forgive me for thinking I had to be less to be loved more. Today, I don't say I do for the past. I say it for the future we're both strong enough to build, intentionally and with eyes wide open. They sealed it not with a kiss, but with a soft press of foreheads. Leora, his hand brushing Callan's cheek, his fingertips gently cradling hers. And beneath that willow tree, a new chapter began. The wedding under the willow tree wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. Not a happily ever after tied in ribbon and perfection, but a conscious daily journey of presence, grace, and growth. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, casting amber hues across their faces, Leora sat by her daughter's crib that evening, holding her final letter. It wasn't for Arya. It was for the women who would one day walk where she had walked, and the men who would one day ask for a second chance, not with grand speeches, but with consistent action. Moral 1. Love is a commitment, not convenience. Callan once loved like a transaction, measured in moments, not meaning. But real love isn't convenient. It doesn't wait for perfect timing. It shows up, even in discomfort, even in fear. Leora didn't return to Callan because he begged. She returned because he changed. Slowly, quietly, permanently. Love at its truest isn't a promise spoken once. It's a vow renewed in how we act, how we grow, and how we repair what we break. Moral 2. Pain doesn't erase your worth. When he left, Leora could have folded in on herself. The world expected her to. But she rose, not by pretending she was fine, but by honoring her pain without letting it define her. Your worth is not measured by how others treat you. It is anchored in how you choose to treat yourself after the damage is done. She didn't need revenge. She needed restoration, and she built it with her own hands. Moral 3. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom. Forgiving Callan wasn't about erasing what he did. It was about freeing herself from the cage of resentment. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without letting the memory control you. It's saying, I release you, so I can reclaim me. Leora chose peace, not because he earned it, but because she refused to carry the weight of his failure into her next chapter. Moral 4. Endings can birth new beginnings. It could have ended in silence. It could have ended with courtrooms and bitterness. But sometimes the ending isn't a closed door. It's a redirection. The broken pieces of Leora's life weren't swept away. They were rearranged into something stronger, more honest, more whole. The woman she became wasn't born in comfort. She was born in collapse, rebuilt brick by brick. Arya would grow up with a story not of abandonment, but of courage. Not of loss, but of rebirth. And now to you, dear listener, if you made it to the end, I know your heart has been through something. Maybe you've felt that kind of betrayal. Maybe you're still healing. But let Leora's journey remind you, even when everything falls apart, you are not broken. You are becoming. If you made it to the end, type rebirth in the comments. Let the world know you're not just surviving, you're rising. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember they are not alone. Because here at Mr. Ross Story Trail, we don't just tell stories, we heal through them.